This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, and welcome to the fifth in our series of seminars on history now and then. My name is Lawrence Goldman. I'm the director of the IHR, but I don't play much of a role this evening. I'm going to hand over to others who are our experts for this seminar. Those of you who've been here through the series will know that this is our fifth, and we look in sequence at the ubiquitous nature of history today in the media. That was our first seminar. We've looked, secondly, at history as a form of heritage. We've asked whether the real past matters or whether we can live with historical myths. And last time we were gathered here, we talked about the way in which each generation feels impelled to rewrite history in its own terms. But tonight we're picturing the past, and this comes out of a discussion I had with Dan, who I'll hand over to in a moment, when we thought really that if one's going to think about the way we do history today, then the use of visual sources becomes very important. I'm old enough to remember my lectures many years ago when I was an undergraduate. It's getting on for 4 decades now. And I don't think any of my lecturers ever showed a picture. I have one of the lecturers on the panel. I attended his lectures assiduously, but I don't think you ever showed a picture. I don't blame him because nobody showed pictures, and now everyone shows pictures. And I wonder why, and I wonder how that changes the way we do history. But that's enough from me because our experts will take this further. Let me hand over to Dan Snowman, who's arranged these seminars.
Thank you, Lawrence. Well, I'm rather hoping that during the course of the evening we will have many interesting historical revelations, including about the boyhood of the director of the IHR. The history and the arts. Many of you have been at some of the earlier seminars in this series, and again, like a kind of leitmotif, references to the arts in general have come up. Tonight's the night where we really will talk about the relationship between history and the arts. Not only the visual arts, but the arts in general. How far the arts and artists can create a pathway to our understanding of the past, and how far perhaps they mislead us and inhibit us in our understanding of the past. I think we historians, we all use art and artists. You know, if you're writing about love or death or money in the 19th century, there's nothing like a good Jane Austen quote or a Dickens quote to make your point. Or if you're writing about the role of women in society, you know, a lovely quote from Madame Bovary or Anna Karenina or something, War and Peace, which we've all been thinking about recently. But that's not the same as actual evidence about the past. It's an illustration of the past. I first, probably like all of you, I first got to know about Julius Caesar or Henry V or Richard III from Shakespeare. And I still have the Shakespearean images in my mind, even though I know he wasn't pretending to be a serious historian. We don't blame him for the fact that he writes about history but inaccurately. Strangely, I sense that our values have changed, that nowadays, if Wolf Hall, either the novel or the television, was shown to be historically inaccurate, we would blame Hilary Mantel for getting it wrong. So I suspect our attitude to the relationship between history and the arts may have changed over time, something that we may talk about in a while. And then there's the whole question, which has always interested me. I've written on the social and economic history of opera. The patronage of the arts. Who were the arts or artworks aimed at? Do they always have to succumb to the reverence for those people who commissioned them? In which case, how and when and where can the arts be subversive historically? So quite a lot of interesting questions that I hope we will raise during the course of the evening. I'm going to introduce the panelists in a moment and ask each of them to talk for 10 minutes broadly defined, and hope that by about 7 o'clock, maybe before, we can open the floor to questions, and then we'll wrap up about 7:30, have drinks, come and ask the panelists all the questions you didn't dare ask in front of everybody else over a drink, and then Lawrence and I are going to take them off for dinner at something like 8:15 or thereabouts. So let me say a word or two about the panelists. And Marion Kant, who's sitting nearest to me here and will speak first, she's a historian of dance, theatre history, cultural theory, I think, Marion, and she's taught in Germany, in the States, in the University of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, here in this country, in Cambridge. And she's pretty omniscient in the history of dance. She was the editor of the Cambridge Companion to Ballet. I first got to know Marion's work in a most interesting book, Hitler's Dancers, where she raises the whole question of how come a regime which believed in long-term, old, traditional Germanic culture and didn't like anything modern with a capital M, except in the case of dance, where it was concerned with the body beautiful, the Aryan values, and therefore did, as far as I understand it, value modern dance. You can see it not only in the work of Laban or somebody, but also in Leni Riefenstahl films, whatever. So Marion, I noticed in the Cambridge Companion, said at one point that the theatre, and I'm quoting her, has always been a hierarchical institution reflecting the social order into which it was born, out of which it grew, and within which it remained. So the relationship between art and its historical context. Let me say a word or two about Simon Goldhill. Simon is a classicist, takes us back to the ancients. He's I think, professor of Greek literature and culture at Cambridge, if I got the title right. Written a great deal on Greek tragedy. But his writings are very broad. He's very across cultures and across times. He's written on the history of Jerusalem. He's written very interestingly to me certainly, on the 19th century classical revival, the way various creative figures in Victorian times picked up on what they took to be the art, the culture, the values of the ancient world. He's director of CRASH, which you may know, which is stands for the Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at Cambridge. Very cross-disciplinary. Simon's a hard man to get to. He's always on his travels or on radio or television. It's great to have got you here tonight, Simon. Vic Gatrell is the man who taught, one of the people who taught Lawrence here. Vic, I think, began, or again, I first knew your work, Vic, when you were writing about attitudes towards capital punishment and the hanging tree. But then he went on and did a wonderful book on the fun, the laughter, the irreverence, the sex, the cartoons of London in the 18th and early 19th century, and then honed in more specifically in another book about the bohemian artistic world of the Covent Garden area. Again, the period of Hogarth and Samuel Johnson and Rowlandson and Gilray and Fielding and Turner and so many others. The history and the arts, as you can certainly see all round. And we have another Simon with us tonight, Simon Shaw Miller, at the end. Simon is Professor of Art History at Bristol, was here at Birkbeck for many years. And he's also one of our great cross-disciplinarians, done pioneering work. The thing that particularly wanted me to invite him to be with us tonight, he's worked on the relationship, not just between the arts and history, but between the visual arts and music, something of great interest. Wagner, who didn't like the loaded word opera, preferred the term Gesamtkunstwerk, work that draws all the arts together. And Simon In fact, both of our Simons have written about Wagner, because, and you were in Bayreuth recently, I think. Yeah, so there we have Simons and Wagner's in common. Simon Shaw Miller's written about Wagner, but also about more recent figures, Picasso, Satie, Paul Klee, John Cage, and the emergence of what came to be dubbed postmodernism, synesthesia, the concert hall as white cube. He's really opened up our eyes and our ears to the links between the arts we look at and the arts that we listen to. So, we'll go in the order in which I've introduced the panel. The relationship between the arts and history. Over to you, Marion. Thank you. I'll try and do that. Let me put this on as well. So that just shout something.
Well,
Which of these do you want to
it
open up?
does seem to work. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I have 6 theses and 2 examples. And I tried to be very, very general in the theses and very specific in the examples, of course. So my first thesis concerning history, historiographical research, and the arts. The past is not separate from our present. We live on and in a time continuum. Our socialization has happened in the past, but it defines our behavior now. It determines what we do, how we do it, how we see something, how we perceive the arts. So the past is in and around us. It is alive. It can be forgotten or suppressed, but it cannot be removed. Yet the past is also the past. It's gone. It's over. We can't repeat or make repeatable certain social or even individual events. We can't go through our childhood again. We can't invoke the French Revolution or the Second World War. So the past is gone, but the process of remembering and studying it can be done through the arts, and the arts are just one of the many ways in which you can do that. Okay. Second point, history and the arts are both part of the ideological frame of a nation, of a country, of a group. Both define its culture in the widest sense, but both accept the rules of their disciplines, and these rules, these ordinary principles, are very different. History has a methodology that is usually organized somehow along the concept of time. Chronology and substantiation of facts, evidence made for arguments, are part of these systematic procedures of conducting historiographical research. And the arts have developed aesthetics, the philosophy that traces and explains the choice of formal structures in relation to artistic subject and content. So history as a form of thought in the present about the past, expressed in writing, film, theatre, can, I think, also turn into a work of art through the beauty of its prose, the clarity and elegance of its arguments, the power of its images. So there might be a set of forces, interrelated set of forces at work here. Third point, the work of art makes past and present merge. The work of art was created in some distant or not so distant past, but has survived a certain period of time and is transported to the present by its mere material existence or by its recreation, its materialization in the performing arts. All these works of art also have brought into existence institutions in which and through which they survive. Museums, publishing houses, theatres, cinemas, galleries, studios, archives, and so on. So the past consistently invades these concrete spaces just as it invades our consciousness. The work of art combines various historical times and spaces, mixes them up, makes them problematic or transparent. The past as an orderly entity of time, of then as opposed to now, is undermined by any work of art. The relationship between past and present is a negotiation process that we enter by engaging with art. But my fourth point, the time scale of past and present also functions in another way. Works of art compress or stretch moments of reflection, of analysis, and enable us to look back, and by looking back to establish ourselves in relation to what was, what might have been, what we imagine should have been. In the works of art, the construction of the past as part of the construction of the present often functions as a procedure of justification, as validation of our thinking. The past is called upon to make us convincing, and it is utilized as basis for the analysis of our contemporary being. My fifth point, by thinking about the past through a specific work of art, we undertake a passage of time travel, forward and backward. We erase an obvious boundary between past and present and activate knowledge about social time and social space, thus understanding ourselves again as social creatures. Works of art, particularly those put on a performance stage, always make concrete a general, an abstract social situation. The past then becomes specific, explicit and precise, but not necessarily factually correct. It turns into a frozen moment of time. My sixth point, works of art are agents of time, not mere reflections or illustrations of the past. They mostly are, therefore, historically biased and inaccurate from a historiographical point of view. Works of art take sides and make commentaries on their age that has become our past. In order to make and understand such commentary and evaluate it, we need to know more. We tend to call that the historical context. That is the condensation of knowledge of a particular time relevant to the specific work of art. We have to decipher, decode through the work of art the ideas, the politics, the realities of the past that have brought into existence that particular, that specific work of art, and that helps explain our present relationship to it. There cannot and does not exist one harmonized, approved perspective that can call or present itself as the past. In short, works of art confuse and subvert any sense of time and history. They disorientate us and they provide us with a new perspective. They destroy clarity and certainty of time and space in order to re-establish them. Works of art, to get back to the beginning, offer us the experience of time as an existential continuum. Now, if we could have the... So my two examples. Dance and ballet, like all other arts, are built according to aesthetic principles that have evolved over a period of time. Formal traditions in relation to narrative content or the abstraction from the narration established the more recent practice of these art forms. In dance, the focus lies on making shapes and forms that bodies create in space by moving according to a technical canon. In movement genres, the continued presence of the past is mediated in performance through the reference of their respective formal materials and the history of experience of the performances themselves. If you think, for instance, of a work like Sacre du Printemps. That is why, for instance, a ballet is different from a modern dance piece. We know that and we acknowledge it when we go and watch the Nutcracker at the Royal Opera House and expect it will be very different at Saddler's Wells. The performance spaces, with their histories, already define vital aspects of the works that are going to be presented. This inbuilt genre reference to tradition also defines the experience of the history of the work itself in every performance. For instance, were the 32 Fouettés performed in the Swan Lake version that you've just seen, or were they omitted, perhaps replaced with something else? Such a detail establishes a relationship between the contemporary presentation of a work and its own past, its history. The choreography is changeable up to a certain point, but also needs to maintain this prospect of reference. Otherwise, it will no longer be recognized and understood as a particular work within a particular tradition. And there's another layer, the intentional reference to another historical time as motivation to redefine the entire genre. That's what modern dance did. That is how it began its own history, by denying that of its immediate predecessor, ballet. It sought ancient mythological sources that had no connection to the emergence and practice of ballet. Ancient Germanic tribal experiences or ancient Greek myths. By ignoring and rejecting what was there, something new arose. The invention of modern dance was dependent on the rejection of history. You see Isadora Duncan here, who was motivated by ancient Greek movement. She thought that the rediscovery of ancient dance would bring about the freedom and equality of human beings in modernity. She proclaimed that in her lecture on the Dance of the Future in 1903 in Berlin. And her conception of modern liberation, based on ancient movement, was a grand illusion. It was also profoundly wrong from a historical perspective. Duncan could not recreate the dance of antiquity. Rather, she invented a modern dance based on the study of Greek vases in the British Museum, combined her acquired knowledge with Richard Wagner's concept of the total work of art of 1849, and then Nietzsche's thoughts on the necessity of tragedy for the rebirth of civilization of 1872. Her dancing women were to secure humanity's future by performing the ecstatic core movement of the Mimas. Exhibit. Head thrown back, you see it here, barefoot, preferably nude, and she tried to establish a new concept and practice of dance that derived the natural from the classical. Her dance was inspired by a past, but it did not bring back that past. It couldn't. It hardly resembled it. It was an imagined, invented past. But a new type of dance arrived on the European performance venues. Now, George Balanchine's Apollo, or Apollo Musagette, conceived of in the year Duncan died, was first performed in 28 as a classical ballet. Classical now refers to the dance technique, not the historical period of antiquity. The ballet tells of the relationship between the ancient Greek god Apollo and the Muses, and the inspiration that leads to the making of art. The Muses appear in point shoes. They are Greek figures in modern dance technology. The piece is Balanchine's comment on antiquity and modernity. Duncan, whom he didn't particularly like, modern dance and modern ballet. It's a smooth journey through millennia of human history in roughly half an hour. So in conclusion, art and history are inseparable. The work of art has its particular date, style, content, and significance, both as as an artifact from the past and as an experience in the present. But recreation of a performance piece from any previous century requires that performers involved decide how much they are bound, or in which way they imagine a particular past and create a particular image of that past.
Hi. My take on the title of the seminar, Picturing the Past, is to look at the pictures that are used to tell history. So what do you see here?
It's a 19th century photograph from the celebrated Bonfils studio in Lebanon. It's a popular image from the extensive archive of travel literature to Palestine. It shows men and women in the traditional familiar dress of the fellahin, reaping and gathering in the field. Central to the image is a man with a long pipe in his mouth, gesturing to a woman who's holding a small sheaf of wheat with her face turned towards the camera. How should it be understood then as a document of history? Well, there's one very familiar way of reading this image as history, to which we could attach the name Edward Said. This is fully part of the Western Orientalist gaze. As we know, Victorian travel literature is a sub-branch of the scholarship of Western Orientalism. It constructs an image of the East that's an instrumental factor in the imperialist project. Here then we're to see with our Western eyes a degraded form of backwards labour. There are thousands of such pictures of outmoded antique style of working in the East. From the perspective of the industrialised, the fully industrialised North, how could such old and inefficient techniques of food production be anything other than quaintly pre-modern at best, desperately needing modern improvement, as we call imperialism? The exoticism of the turban and flowing robes adds another familiar note. The costumes of the East always go along with the customs. As the body shapes too mark these humans as other to the upright and dignified Western travellers, the Vagina paradigmatic squatting. Yet such a reading, familiar from pretty well every university classroom, is so woefully inadequate that will itself need historical analysis as a willed gesture of misunderstanding. Let me explain why. This image, also the original, has a title. It's called Ruth and Boaz. That is, although it's a picture, a photograph of contemporary workers in Palestine, it's labelled with the names of characters from the Bible. Nor are they any old characters. Ruth was a favourite of Victorian female religious fascination, Ruth clinging so fondly and faithfully to the aged Naomi and gleaning in the field of Boaz as an ideal of female biblical virtue, a paradigm of the faithful and a model of conversion in an age of missionaries. Notice the woman in this picture is precisely holding a gleaning. What's more, Ruth and Boaz are the genealogical source of the house of David, from which is descended Jesus himself, who walked these mountains. The title makes this picture a tableau vivant of biblical story. What being asked to see in the present of Palestine is a deep continuity with the biblical past. The presence of the pipe might strike us as an insistence reminding the modern, but the picture's title insists that we look past the pipe into a different temporality, where the current mundane world is thus layered with the type of the past, and every day becomes a sign of religious continuity. This picture is a perfect example of what might be called the biblical gaze. What the photographs claim on the real represents is a privileged understanding of the presence of a religious vision in the embodied world of the Holy Land. When the Bible as a scripture was being so stridently challenged by new critical history, and archaeology was attempting to rediscover the truth on the ground, in the ground, of the Bible's narrative. Hand in hand with such a desire for the real of religion, photography offered the real of the Bible in images to inform the imagination. Each snapshot like this is an act of verification. This is how it really is, and how it really was. Each contributes to the wholeness and integrity of truth. Photography's real entails the biblical real. This picture embodies the truth, the real of Scripture. It proves biblical history. So looking at the Holy Land is never like looking at Japan and Borneo or India. As Dean Stanley put it succinctly, we should not be Christians if we could see Jerusalem and the Holy Land as we would any other town or any other country. A visit to the Holy Land, he insists, becomes a real religious lesson because it brings before our eyes things we do not see. That is, seeing needs vision. It needs a Christian perspective, the biblical gaze. He wants you to see yourself in Christian history put yourself in the picture. We'd need far more, of course, fully to locate this image. We'd need to note at least Ottoman Orientalism too, which also rather despised the fellow in and their old-fashioned clothes and ways. But enough has been said to underline that when modern historians want to see such an image as just another sign of Western Orientalism, they need powerfully distorting the Incas in the past. Such an analysis misses the impact and aim of such images in at least one historical form. Now, pictures are often taken as sites of memory, as encodings of the past, capturing what's real. I prefer to take modern readings of this picture as an example of how photographs become tokens in an ongoing battle of how images are to inform the imagination. A battle that depends on forgetting and not seeing as much as memory and revealing. It is in itself a gesture of political affiliation, not so much historical analysis, to know such images as no more than Western imperialism. To do so means to totally repress both Ottoman involvement in the image wars over cultural hegemony, and above all to ignore the Western obsession with religion, which frames these images in a quite different way. Quite a second image. It's a slightly more famous one. It's smaller, sorry. It's Western imperialism in all its glory. This is Allenby marching through the Jaffa Gate into Jerusalem to claim it for British rule in 1917. The British press revelled in the fact that Allenby had marched in on foot. Kaiser Wilhelm, they crowed, not only had ridden in on horseback into the city, dressed as a crusader, true, arrogant, vulgar, destined for a fall, they say, but he'd even destroyed part of the wall to make his grand entrance. Allenby was a properly religious and humble man. This was Britishness at its best, modest before the history of Jerusalem. And so this famous image has gone down in history. Until at least you read the cabinet papers. Then you discover that this entrance was devised by none other than Mark Sykes, author of the notorious Sykes-Picot Agreement that divided the Middle East between the Western powers and invented the national borders that give such people today. The entrance was designed precisely as a propaganda victory over the Germans. A staggering blow to German dream of domination in the East of the Kaiser's pretensions, as the Daily Sketch conveniently summarised. Yet the cabinet was deeply anxious from the beginning about Muslim response to this activity. One of the rather dumber members of the cabinet proposed that the Brits should spin the takeover as the fulfilment of a prophecy that Turkish rule would end when the waters of the Nile came to Jerusalem and the Prophet entered the Golden Gate. Now, the British water system, he said, would bring in the water, no problem. And Allenby could be understood in Arabic as Al-Navi, the Prophet. So why didn't he enter through the Golden Gate in triumph? Well, this ludicrous plan, fortunately, was ditched. But not before Allenby was tickled by it. He thought it was rather a nice idea. When it was dropped, he wrote to his wife that unfortunately he was going to have to act humble. This picture is not the spontaneous humility of the English leader as it has been promoted for so many years. It was announced as such, it was received as such, it was celebrated as such, as a historical document. It's rather a carefully staged spectacle of humility for a world audience. It's a piece of making history. So in short, images, for me, never illustrate, never picture history. That was part of making history. Top right.
And then we get music.
Have you double click hard on that?
That's it.
The song? Clearly knew that. Over to you, Vic.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I come to you really as the Philistine among the gathering, as an unapologetic empiricist, but also as a historian, a one-time social historian, who once never used pictures at all, who worked on statistics, God help me, of criminal behavior, who slowly has wooed himself by the business of looking at pictures as historical evidence. Now, I'm terribly under-theorized. I do not debate deeply or in fancy language what the purpose of the pictures are, because I trust my instincts and I trust something else. I trust a kind of emotional response to images as indicators of feeling in the past, of how past people responded to a form of reality. And I don't meditate it deeply, but I do write about it. I do write big books, one on hanging, as who are you? Daniel said. Two on caricature in the 18th century, and three, another big one on the art world and the representations of reality in the anti-academic, unacademic art of Covent Garden across the 18th century. A reality that was witnessed by artists, palpably so, on the streets of humble people going about their business, filtered, of course, through their visions, through their projections, just as the interpretation of those things is filtered through my projections and my understandings. That element of fantasy and imagination and the importance of the individual, the recipient, I take as axiomatic and take for granted. But I still trust the evidence of images that are sensitively regarded, contemplated, and are experienced through the emotions. Now, through aesthetic emotions as well as otherwise, I still trust that. Because all my work has been, I think, written out of a kind of emotional fascination with the oddity of dead people walking across streets that I tread in the here and now. And I know I felt this when I came to Cambridge from darkest Africa as a student. I was besotted by the fact that Isaac Newton had trodden on these pavements, more or less, that I trod today. That sense of the past that was enacted in cities and in towns and in places was powerfully with me, really with me in the sense that Marion conveyed in the first paper. I want to really identify what I'm trying to say incoherently by explaining what hit me in 1994-5 when I was working on the hanging tree execution and the English people. It wasn't designed as an illustrated book, but it had illustrations, and it was the first time that I myself recognized the power of the image, not least this one on the board at the moment. How do I move on? Not yet. Okay, go back. This is the image of a scaffold outside Newgate Prison that was drawn to indicate something horrible and frightful. Let's go on. Yes. It's from Thackeray, 1840. Thackeray writes a famous, toe-curlingly awful article, dreadful article, about what it felt like as a civilized man of manners and respectability to go to watch a man hanged. It's Courvoisier, a murderer, who murdered his master. He was a servant, which made the crime worse. Thackeray describes in this long article how going up Holborn and up Snow Hill towards Newgate, before us lies the prison, but something a great deal more awful to look at. Seizes the eye at once and makes the heart beat. It is, and this is in the typography, in the text itself, as that image is straight out of the typesetting of the article. There it stands black and grey, jutting out from a little door in the prison. Feel the kind of flame of the language, the little door. As you see it, you feel a kind of dumb electric shock, which causes one to start a little and give a sort of gasp for breath. Now, when I was writing the book, that's exactly what I felt about the sheer bloody business in one chapter, which was the closest I've ever come to writing pornography. A chapter that had to be there, chapter 2 it is, on what it was like to hang someone and what happened. It was this dumb shock, this sense of disgust that Thackeray conveyed. But what, of course, brings us to the point of this evening is the image that Thackeray used and chose. It's an emblem, it's an icon. It's not a reality, but it has a kind of poetic reality. I want to turn to the actual reality, or versions of it. And you'll see how easy it is, how we need not make a meal out of decoding the purposes of the artist in question. What, in these images I'm going to show you follow, what will be palpable, what will be obvious, is the ways in which the reality that is being depicted is distorted, are distorted by the audience or the imagined audience and by the purposes of the artist himself. This is a depiction of the execution of the Cato Street conspirators in 1820, which I'm going to be staying with for a minute or two more. It's a very tidy picture, but you do have, on the left, the executioner holding up the head of Thistlewood, or one of the others, who've been hanged, and who's had his head hacked off with a butcher's knife, to be held up for the last time in British history, thank goodness, the last time this antique ritual was engaged in of decapitation. They had been spared the quartering of the ancient sentence. But they were to be decapitated as traitors because they had imagined the death of His Majesty's government. They were planning to blow them up and kill them at supper, at dinner, in Gloucester Square. This is a polite tidying up of that reality. It conveys nothing of the energy, of the terror, of the awfulness of it, and it occupies, of course, a fairly straightforward pamphlet, aiming with no ambition whatsoever, has no ambition, artistic ambition behind it, aiming merely to accompany the text. The plebeian image has much more energy. This is from a woodcut with verses and with description of the crimes imagined, and it's identifiably outside Newgate. It's in St. Sepulchre's Church, and I think the heads are coming off, or some of them are still hanging there. But what it does convey, interestingly, are the soldiers, the state, power, control is present in this picture in a sense that plebeians would understand only too well. And of course, axiomatically, we all understand this isn't a reality, photographically or experientially even, but it is a closer approximation to a situation that we know through textual evidence. Never deny the importance of the textual underpinning of pictures of this kind. We know actually exists tension of the crowd, the immensity of the crowd. And that takes us closer to the horror of it, the cutting down of the body, the head being held down on the bottom left corner. Oops. And then this one. Another representation of the horror of it, and again, I suppose one would call it a plebeian representation, or at least a common person's representation. There's no attempt to artistify what's going on here. This is a woodcut that is included as a frontispiece in a popular history of the Cato Street conspiracy. And the blood, the gore, is splashing. And the man, we've got a pointer, no, yes. This man here is the shielded, masked executioner. Actually, he's a surgeon from St. Thomas's Hospital who's assumed to know how best to chop off heads. It's a bloody business, and the others are waiting to be done. And here too are the soldiers in the background, because this was a hugely inflammatory moment in London history, a hugely dangerous moment, when at last government had, however, outwitted the conspirators and the treason, the traitors and the plotters. But then finally, I think it's finally, we come to this. Theodore Jericho comes to London in 1820. He's come the year before to exhibit the raft of the Medusa. He likes London. He's touched by the kind of radical enthusiasms. He stays in Edgware Road, in the house, in the lodging run, I think, by a grocer, by someone quite local, but it happens to be around the corner from Cato Street, where the conspiracy was actually trapped and caught and cornered. He knows what it's all about, Parisian though he is, and he goes to the hanging. There's no question about it, through gossip, through curiosity, except that in his sketch here, he's got only 3 people being hanged instead of 5, and moreover, it could not have been drawn like that on the spot. Rough sketch though it is, because the sheet is too big. It's a big A3, is it A3, I think, the big Xerox sheet. And he would not have seen it at that angle. So there's imagination at work here, but also reality. But the most intense effect of it is conveyed by those eyes. Nobody before in art history, anywhere, any culture that I know of, had made an effort so conscientiously to gaze into the eyes of a man about to be hanged. And the staring eyes, I think, are perhaps most extraordinary, the most extraordinarily moving and shocking and terrifying and emotionally disturbing icon of the subject that I was then choosing to write about. I was quite disturbed, very unhappy about it. But the power of that image, unrealistic though it was, connected with the power of my subject, the power of my writing, the energy I was putting into it. And that was the essence of the image for me as a pragmatic historian. I did not need to theorize or speculate or generalize. It spoke for itself. Thank you.
This reminds me of the Goya image of the man being shot. Simon, if you can get your pictures. Vic, while we're doing that, I'm just wondering, you mentioned Cato Street and Edgware Road. Was the hanging at Tyburn, which is Marble Arch?
No, it's outside Newgate.
Ah, I see, because I mean, there was hanging just up the road from there, wasn't there?
Yeah, 17 years.
If we can put this something like so. Right, there you go.
I too would like to claim to be the interloper in this group, because I'm an art historian for my sins. That is, I deal with images all the time. I probably deal with images much more successfully than I deal with history. So my apologies on the history side of things. But I do want to say something about what it is that art historians do. Because it seems to me, given that there are only 21 schools in this country that teach history of art, and there are a number of very small departments. My own department at Bristol, for example, consists of 7.5 staff. We've got one very short. No, she's shared actually with the history department. And the history department is a small department, but they have 33. So art history is a small discipline in every sense. I'm the tallest professor there is in this country. It's a small discipline. It's politically often outmaneuvered in the politics of universities. So if you forgive me, I will explain a little about what it is that art historians do, just in case you're unfamiliar with the practice of art history. I suppose the most important central claim that art historians make is that the nature of some of the material that they deal with, not all of the material that they deal with, but some of the material that they deal with has an important aesthetic dimension. We've been talking about this in the last paper. It is that experience of the work that is something that we hold on to. That there is pleasure or pain or fear and a response to artworks that it's important not to lose sight of. I suppose we should explain that art historians look at art, but we also look at this thing called visual culture. That's the contemporary term for it. Years ago, in the 1980s, I remember long discussions about the relationship between art history and design history, whether design history was a separate type of discipline from art history, whether it could be incorporated into art history. More recently, the idea of visual culture is something which is either separate from or connected to art history in one way or another. And then this other term that hasn't been mentioned explicitly this evening, material culture, the an interest in material culture. Art historians, again, quite happy to dabble in material culture as well as visual culture. So we're interested in visual material of all sorts. Playbills, posters, postage stamps, paintings, sculptures, buildings, all sorts of things. The important thing for us, I think, is that these objects have symbolic value as well as historical value, if you like. We're interested in the material and physical makeup of the objects. We're also interested in the way in which we might read these images. And I'll show you an image, well, I'm showing you an image at the moment, but I'll talk more about it in a minute to explain what I mean. We're interested in the societies that produce these objects. We're interested in the societies and contexts in which these objects are consumed, as we've already talked about. But we're not just interested in objects, we're interested in processes. We're interested in the mechanisms by which these objects come to have value in the first place, how the notion of art as a concept gets attributed to one group of objects and not to another group of objects. Important in this process of analysis are the particular characteristics of individual works of art. So we pay particularly close attention to the material makeup of objects. We understand objects both synchronically and diachronically. We're interested, in other words, in how art objects, or the production of art as a self-conscious cultural activity, relates to its own history, as well as how those objects relate to the material circumstances of production, the political, economic circumstances in which they find themselves. Art history involves aesthetic judgment, there is no doubt about it. This is concerned with visual memory, an awareness of an artist's style. We have to familiarise ourselves in the same way as a musicologist who's going to be able to tell the difference between the middle period Mozart string quartet and late period Haydn string quartet needs to know what Mozart's string quartets sound like. So is the case with an art historian. If you're going to identify the hand of a particular artist, you need to know what that work looks like. It requires a developed visual imagination. We're also, of course, interested in contracts, letters, contemporary texts of one sort or another. Scientific studies of technique are also extremely useful ways of gathering information. But artworks demand an aesthetic response before they can be understood. They need to be understood in terms of this aesthetic response, I would suggest. The sort of subject matter that I've looked at in the past includes, well, it used to include LP design, but LPs and long-distance CD design I'm still interested in, and cover flow, which is a technique that's used on MP3s. I'm interested in the visual dimension of musical objects. I'm interested in posters. I'm interested in a wide range of design objects as well. But I'm also perhaps most fired up by art objects. So I want to just say a little thing about this particular Picasso, just to show you something about the type of questions that we ask as art historians. One of the interesting things about Picasso's collages is that they can be dated extremely accurately. They can be dated by the newspaper fragments that are included in many of them. And this is dated 10th of November 1912. From the small newspaper fragment on the bottom left-hand side. But one of the things I always get my students to do whenever they look at an image is to describe what it is they see. And it's an extremely difficult thing to do. If I ask you all not to look at the screen now, just look at me and describe what it is that you can see up there, or what you've been looking at in the past few minutes while I've been chuntering away at the front here, I would be interested to see how much detail you could actually record of that image. We are trained very well to express ourselves in words. We're judged in terms of our academic achievement by our ability to express ourselves in words. Our training in visual matters usually stops at the age of about 5, and unless you're engaged in art history, doesn't really often pick itself up after that period at all. But the training of visual acuity is an extremely important skill, I think, in and of itself. But anyway, let's just describe what this image consists of. It's a painting which, it's a work of art which has as the background brown and white flowered cotton wallpaper, over which in the bottom left-hand corner is stuck a fragment of newspaper. The horizontal placement of this strip of newspaper suggests that it signifies both itself as newspaper and the tabletop on which this still life is placed. Towards the lower right, on a separate white sheet of drawing paper, is an analytic cubist drawing of a glass. The profile aspect of this image forms a reduced echo of the right-hand side of the guitar's curved body. A black semicircle of paper is stuck over parts of both the newspaper and the drawing of the glass, forming the bottom section of the guitar. The left side of the guitar is composed of a sheet of painted imitation wood-grained paper, a technique that Picasso learnt from Braque. Braque's father was an interior decorator. The main body of the guitar is defined by an absence, by a space. The fingerboard is a sheet of blue paper cut into a parallelogram, over which at the bottom has been stuck a white paper circle representing the guitar's sound hole. So this work consists of the plain printed materials, the sheet and the newspaper, plain pieces of paper, the wallpaper in the background, all of which play complicated roles in performing an understanding around what this object meant, both specifically to Picasso but also in its cultural context. There's a rather wonderfully balanced and succinct design, I think. The use of the wallpaper renders the picture plane, the surface of the painting, flat. It projects the other elements of the still life forward into the viewer's space. Interestingly, the sound hole, by definition a hollow space, is represented by the lightest tone, white, not, as one might expect, by the absence of light, black. In addition, it's placed physically forward of all the other elements. A cavity, in this sense, becomes a form of projection. This reversal is taken forward later in Picasso's reliefs, the guitar, where the sound hole is rendered as a tube, if you can call one of those to mind. So there's a play in this object between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, between the physical makeup of the object and the way in which it's specifically represented here. But let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are being shown. Here's the newspaper. This is the entire newspaper from which it comes. And the final page of the song indicated on the right-hand side where the little part of the song has been cut out. That's the bit that found its way into Picasso's collage. The song is a song by Marcel Le Gay. It's a common song that was sung in the bars of Paris at this time. It's a song that Picasso knew very well. It's a song about transient love. It's a song about the it draws parallel between a fleeting romantic encounter and flowers losing their blooms. At the highest point of their bloom, they're about to lose their petals, just like love can turn to ash at the next moment. So it's a sad little love song. The newspaper itself is rather significant. It comes from a newspaper, as I said, dated the 12th of November. It comes, at least in Picasso's hand, to form a partial headline. The battle has commenced, we might translate it in the version here. So he's just cut off part of the word. The battle is begun, the battle is engaged. But it comes from this much wider headline which describes a battle in the Balkans, a dispatch from Constantinople. And it is this engagement with the debates around the impact of the Balkan Wars that Picasso was so involved in. There are a number of his collages produced at this time which are quite explicit in their engagement with ideas about the Balkan War and his own position as a non-combatant, as an anarchist, somebody who rejected the idea of this developing into a pan-European conflict. This is effectively, this work is in many ways Picasso's own engagement in the debates about the nature of the Balkan Wars, what the Balkan Wars might mean both to him personally, but also to the artistic group that he worked with. He was also mightily cheesed off by the fact that he was being written about by a whole range of theorists at this time who were explaining what Cubism was all about. He didn't like other people explaining on his behalf what his works were about. He was also engaged in a very close relationship with Braque in terms of artistic innovation. There's a famous phrase in which they describe their relationship as like two mountaineers work together. Face. So they're in very close communication much of this time. Picasso is responding, it's been argued, can't go into the details, but he's responding to a series of paintings that collages that Braque had recently produced. So the cutting off of the headline in order to signify general engagement in hostilities rather than a specific engagement in hostilities signifies a whole range of things. It might be his hostility towards the critics, it might be the fact that he's engaged in a battle with Braque. It is also a reference to the Balkan Wars. So it's a number of things. This headline is in opposition to the other elements, the elements of music and the significance of the guitar itself. The guitar, for a whole range of reasons, signifies both Picasso's sense of Spanishness, but it's also an extremely important aspect of Vanitas symbolism. And it's understanding this work not just as a document of an interest in the Balkan Wars, but as an art historical engagement with the idea of Vanitas imagery, Vanitas imagery that has many of the same elements that Picasso is using here. A lute in the background, which through the process of music history, guitars inherited much of the musical literature of lutes. So while lutes were often symbolic of pregnancy in the 18th century, certainly in Dutch the word lute was often used, L-U-I-T was used as a synonym for the vagina, and strumming on a lute therefore had a whole range of connotations that I'm not going to go into. But in this particular example, the lute is turned upside down. You can see it's got no strings. It is then much more closely related to the idea of death, the passing of time, transience, and this vanitas imagery attaches itself very much to the idea of death. You can see where I'm going here in relation to this image. It is this opposition between the idea of love and the idea of death that Picasso is playing with in this work. It's significant, though, I think, that it's not just the fact that these elements are there, but how they're there. That the idea of war is mediated through the guitar with song, and that the song itself is about love, it's about love between a young man and a woman. Picasso was, as always, in love with another woman. He often wooed these women through his artworks in rather complicated ways. But it's also a debate about high culture and low culture, it's about mass circulation in newspapers, it's about popular songs, it's about analytic cubist understandings of reality, it's about the juxtaposition, the literal juxtaposition of the illusionism of flowers, which are just wallpaper, with the analytic representation of a glass. This is the reality of the glass, juxtaposed to the wood graining, which is an imitation style. It's not real wood, it's painted wood. But as painted wood, it's more painting than it is imitation. You see what I mean? So Picasso's constantly playing with these different levels of signification, using popular imagery and art in order to engage with contemporary reality. And it's by understanding both the diachronic and synchronic aspects of these images, I think, that we can gain some historical perspective on. Thank you.